Beatrice Holloway drove her knee into the frozen ground, grabbed the young man's shattered arm with both hands and pulled. He screamed. The whole street heard it. Behind her, a woman shrieked, "Stop her! Someone stop her! She's going to kill him!" Beatrice didn't stop. She had done this before. In a flooded mining camp at 2 a.m, in the back of a moving wagon with no light and no help. Beside her dying father, who pressed her hands against a stranger's broken leg and whispered, "Don't you dare let go." She didn't let go then. She wasn't letting go now. The bone moved. The young man went silent, not dead, just past the worst of it, and the street around her went so quiet you could hear the wind come off the ridge. Then, Sheriff Nathan Caldwell's voice cut through the silence. Low, stunned, like a man seeing something he didn't have language for yet. "Who taught you to set a bone like that?" Beatrice sat back on her heels. She looked up at him. This man who had married her 3 weeks ago, without once believing she was anything more than a practical solution to an empty house, and she held his gaze and said without flinching, "My father. He was the only doctor in places where people had nobody else." The crowd didn't move. And that was the moment Willow Creek stopped seeing what Beatrice Holloway looked like and started seeing who she actually was. But to understand what that moment cost her, what it took to get there, you need to go back to the beginning. If this story already has hold of you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every part of this story is coming, and you don't want to miss a single one. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back 3 weeks. To the day a train arrived late into Willow Creek and everything changed. The crowd on the depot platform wasn't there to welcome anyone. They were there, the way people gather at the edge of something they expect to find. Amusing. Arms folded, voices, low positioned for the best view. Word had gotten around that Sheriff Caldwell's mail-order bride was arriving on the afternoon train, and in a town where entertainment came scarce, that was enough to pull people out of their shops and their kitchens and their mid-afternoon errands. Nathan Caldwell stood apart from them. He had his badge on his chest, his hat pulled against the glare, and his hands clasped behind his back, in the particular way of a man who has decided well in advance not to feel anything he hasn't scheduled. He was 34 years old. He had been a widower for 3 years. He had written 14 letters to a placement agency in Cincinnati over the course of 6 months, answered every question with the precision of someone filing a report, and he had not once written down what kind of woman he hoped she would be, because he'd decided that part wasn't relevant. He needed a capable wife. He had said so plainly in every letter. He was not looking for love. He knew what love cost. He had paid that cost once, and he was not willing to carry that kind of debt again. What he wanted was someone steady, someone who wouldn't break under the work, someone who understood that what he was offering was a decent life, not a romantic one. The agency had been perfectly clear. They had someone in mind. Her name was Beatrice Holloway, 26. Father recently deceased. Traveling background. Practical skills. He had read the letter twice and written back the same day. Send her. He was not prepared for the way she came off that train. She was the last passenger down, and she came alone. No porter, no assistance requested or accepted, hauling a trunk that would have made most men reconsider their grip balanced against her hip, like she'd done it 100 times because she probably had. She was a full-figured woman, broad through the shoulders, her brown dress, travel-worn and plain, her dark hair pinned up and coming loose at the temples from the long ride. She hit the platform with both feet like someone who intended to stay standing, scanned the crowd with dark, steady eyes, and did not flinch at a single thing she saw in them. The whispers started before she'd taken 3 steps. "Lord have mercy, that's her. He wrote all the way to Cincinnati for that. Poor man, someone ought to tell him." Nathan heard every word. He crossed the platform before he'd consciously decided to 4 strides, putting himself between her and the crowd, and he reached for the trunk. She let him take it. But the look she gave him made absolutely clear she hadn't needed him to. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was even, unhurried, like someone who had arrived exactly where she meant to arrive. "I hope the wait wasn't too long." "Train was late. "That's not your fault." "No," she said. "It isn't." They stood, two strangers, measuring each other across 3 feet of weathered depot planking. And then Nathan turned toward the wagon, and she walked beside him, and neither of them spoke again until the sound of the platform crowd had fallen away behind them. The ride to the ranch took 30 minutes. They spent most of it in silence, and it was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that settles between two people who have both decided to take their time before saying the wrong thing. The land rolled past open grass red rock ridges, catching the late light sky going wide and gold in every direction, and Beatrice sat straight in the wagon seat and looked at it all with an expression Nathan couldn't immediately name. Not peace, not grief, something in between. Something that looked, he realized slowly, a great deal like familiarity with impermanence. "You've traveled a lot," he said, not a question. "All my life," she said. "My father was a frontier healer. We followed the need mining camps, railroad towns, anywhere people were living far from proper care." A pause. "I'm used to arriving somewhere new. Is that hard?" She considered it honestly, in a way that told him she wasn't going to give him a polite answer. "It used to be," she said. "When I was young, I wanted a garden. Neighbors I knew by name passed one season." She looked out at the land. "You learn to carry what matters with you." Nathan turned that over in his mind. The women he knew in Willow Creek talked about their homes as anchors. This woman talked about carrying things. It was a different grammar entirely, and it sat in his chest in a way he didn't examine. "The ranch needs work," he said after a while. "I've been managing alone since for a few years. I want to be straight with you about that." "I appreciate straight," she said. "The hands are good men. They'll take some time to adjust," she offered, no edge in it. "Yes. So will I," she said. "That seems fair." He glanced sideways at her and found her watching the road ahead with that same level assessing gaze she'd had from the moment she stepped off the train. There was something in the set of her jaw that reminded him of men he'd known in difficult circumstances, that particular quality of having already made peace with what was coming and walking toward it anyway. He looked back at the road. Something behind his ribs had shifted by a fraction, the kind of small movement you don't announce even to yourself. The ranch came into view around a long bend in the track, and he watched her face as she saw it for the first time. She didn't perform polite reaction. She didn't cover disappointment. She just looked at it the way you look at something you're already figuring out how to help. "It's solid," she said. "It is. South end of the porch railing needs replacing." He blinked. "How can you tell from here?" "The angle it's sitting at, the lean." She glanced at him, not unkindly. "You've probably walked past it so many times you stopped seeing it." He had no answer for that, because she was right. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and she was down from the seat before he'd set the brake, walking toward the house with the same unhurried competence she'd shown at the depot, and Nathan stood beside his wagon a moment longer than he needed to, watching her go, trying to remember the last time someone had noticed something on his land that he had stopped seeing. He couldn't. Inside the wagon seat, something else he'd stopped seeing had just shifted quietly without permission, and he wasn't ready to look at it directly yet. The first week was its own education. Not because Beatrice struggled, because she didn't, and that surprised people who had already decided she would. She reorganized the kitchen on the second morning with a systematic efficiency that had the ranch hands hovering around the stove by afternoon, drawn by smells that hadn't come from that kitchen in 3 years. She found 2 billing errors in the household accounts without being asked and corrected them without commentary. She identified a drainage problem along the west fence line by walking it at dawn one morning, and she mentioned it to Nathan over supper with the directness of someone sharing information, not angling for praise. None of that was what made Nathan notice her. What made him notice her was the quiet. Not her quiet, her effect on the quiet of others. The way the ranch hands who had been speaking in short, careful sentences around her started letting their voices go natural. The way conversations at the supper table had started running past the meal. The way Walt, who had complained about every cook in the bunkhouse for 3 years, had stopped complaining, not because he was suppressing it, but because he'd apparently run out of things to complain about. Willow Creek itself was slower to shift. Mavis Hutchins at the dry goods store found a way to look Beatrice up and down on every visit, her lips pressed together in that particular expression women use when they are being openly cruel and maintaining plausible innocence about it. "I imagine it's quite an adjustment," Mavis said on the third visit, smiling with only the lower half of her face. "Coming from, well, wherever it is you've come from." "Cincinnati most recently," Beatrice said pleasantly. "Before that Wyoming, before that Kansas." "Yes," Mavis said with the tone of someone filing information away to use later. "I'd heard." Beatrice bought her flour and her coffee and her thread and left without giving Mavis anything worth keeping. It was only back in the wagon with the reins in her hands that she let herself breathe out slowly and release what she'd been holding in her shoulders. She had been doing this her entire life, moving into towns where people had already made their decisions before she opened her mouth. Being too much of something, too large, too quiet, too plain, too capable, in ways that made certain people deeply uncomfortable. She had learned years ago that arguing those decisions was wasted effort. The answer was patience. Work. Letting your hands speak when your words would be dismissed before they landed. But Willow Creek had Vivian Ashford, and Vivian Ashford required a different kind of patience than Mavis Hutchins. Vivian was the wife of the town's most successful merchant, Gerald Ashford, whose enterprises had expanded in recent years to include the livery estate in the hotel and a controlling share of the grain cooperative. Vivian wore that position the way some women wear diamonds deliberately always, and in a way designed to ensure you registered the weight of it. She was not petty the way Mavis was petty. Mavis operated on small resentments. Vivian operated on architecture. She had built a careful social structure in Willow Creek over years, and she maintained it with the systematic attention of someone who understood that influence once let go does not easily return. She had expected Nathan Caldwell's new wife to be someone she could position. A young woman from a respectable family, grateful for acceptance, willing to understand that Vivian's approval had value. Someone she could place like a piece on a board where it wouldn't disturb anything she'd built. Instead, Nathan had married a traveling healer's daughter who arrived with calloused hands and a worn trunk, and who seemed in every encounter Vivian manufactured to be operating entirely outside the social framework Vivian had constructed, not defying it, not even reacting to it, simply existing outside it, the way weather exists outside architecture, indifferent to the structure's opinion of itself. This was not something Vivian knew how to address. She started with what she called subtlety. A comment at the quilting circle, some women find community life an adjustment, especially those from less settled backgrounds. A quiet word with the pastor's wife about whether Mrs. Caldwell might benefit from guidance in proper community participation. A mention to Nathan's deputy passed with the lightness of casual concern that the sheriff surely deserved a wife who elevated his standing in town. None of it reached Beatrice directly. But it reached Nathan. He came home from town on a Thursday with a jaw tight enough to cut glass and set his hat down harder than the hook required. Beatrice put a plate in front of him, filled his coffee without being asked, and sat down across the table and waited. "Vivian Ashford's been talking," he said. "I figured she had." "Does that not—" He stopped. Tried a different door. "It doesn't trouble you." "Does it trouble you?" she asked. He looked up sharply. She was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, not challenging him, just asking, genuinely asking, and he found he couldn't dodge it. "She told Mary Ellsworth I'd been taken advantage of by the agency," he said flat and low, "that a man in my position shouldn't have had to settle." The word settle dropped between them like something with weight. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "And if you had been there when she said it," she asked, "what would you have told her?" He met her eyes directly. That she didn't know what she was talking about. Something in Beatrice's face shifted, not softness exactly, but a release of something held carefully. "Then we're fine," she said. She picked up her fork. "The biscuits are going cold." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked up his fork. And they ate, and the silence between them had changed in texture, was warmer somehow than it had been. And Nathan did not examine why, but he felt it, and he didn't try to put it back where it had been. The cowboys completed their own adjustments on their own schedule. Hector the foreman, a lean, weathered man of 50, who'd worked this land since before Nathan bought it, watched everything first and said nothing until he'd made up his mind. Caleb and Pete, the brothers from Oklahoma, were loud and good-natured and in perpetual competition with each other about everything, including who had adapted most smoothly to the new arrangement, which meant neither of them had. Thomas Reed, barely 20, who'd come looking for work the previous spring and stayed because he had nowhere better to go, was the most obviously uncertain, too young to disguise it and too earnest not to care. And then there was Walt. Walt was at least 65 by his own uncertain count, and he had a comment on everything and delivered it without waiting for an invitation. He was the one who broke first, not because he was the most comfortable with change, but because Walt had never learned to let curiosity sit unaddressed. He appeared at the kitchen door on the fourth morning, hat in hand, and stood watching Beatrice work through the contents of her father's medical case, cleaning instruments, checking tincture bottles, refolding bandage cloth with practiced hands. "What is all that?" he said. She looked up. "My father's medical kit." He stepped closer, head tilted, looking down at the instruments with unconcealed interest. Lances, bone-setting tools, a suturing kit, small labeled bottles arranged in a specific order. "Your daddy was a doctor." "A healer," she said. "There's a difference depending on who you're asking." "What kind of difference?" "A doctor has a certificate and an office and charges by the visit," she said with a dryness that Walt visibly appreciated. "A healer goes where he's needed and takes whatever people can give." Walt pulled out a chair without being invited something. Nathan had told her he did everywhere in every house, without apparent awareness that it required an invitation, and he sat down across from her and rested his forearms on the table. "You know how to use that stuff, all of it." "All of it," she said. "I've been working beside my father since I was 9. He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands move. Then, "My shoulder's been wrong since February. Took a fall off the north fence. Doc Pruitt said it was a strain and it would heal." "Has it healed?" "No." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. "Let me see it." "Just like that." "You brought it up," she said. "I assume you wanted someone to do something about it." Walt opened his mouth, closed it. "Fair point," he said. What followed was 15 minutes that the other hands would hear about in such varied and embellished versions over the following week, that the accounts eventually became nearly irreconcilable. What was consistent across all of them, Walt went in loud and came out quiet. There was at one point a sound that brought Caleb and Pete to the doorway at a dead run, and Walt emerged from the kitchen moving his arm in a slow arc, raising it, lowering it, raising it again, with the expression of a man receiving news he had not expected and did not entirely know how to process. "Well," he said, standing on the porch, his voice coming out rough. "I'll be." "Keep moving it," Beatrice said from the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Gently. Don't strain it, but don't stop moving it." Walt looked at her, then at his arm, then back at her. "How long's it gonna take?" "A week before you notice real difference. 2 weeks before you stop thinking about it." He put his hat on, took it off, put it on again. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. "Come back if it worsens." He walked off the porch and halfway across the yard before he turned around. "Mrs. Caldwell." "Yes." "That's a considerable skill you've got." "My father taught me everything I know," she said quietly. "I just try not to waste it." Walt nodded once like that was the correct answer to something, and walked the rest of the way to the barn. After that, the kitchen became a place the hands found reasons to visit. Caleb appeared the next day with a hand torn on fence wire, holding it out with the bravado of a young man who is pretending he is not relieved to have an excuse. "Caught it on a barb," he said. "Probably nothing." Beatrice looked at it. "Sit down. I can just—" "Caleb, sit down." He sat. She cleaned the wound with a solution that made him hiss through his teeth, and she stitched the deepest part with 3 even passes, while he stared very hard at the far wall and tried to look like a man who was entirely comfortable with what was happening. "You're going to want to keep that dry for 3 days," she said, wrapping it. "If it goes red at the edges or starts to heat up, you come back to me, You do not wait. Yes, ma'am. Do you understand what I said? You don't wait. Yes, ma'am, he said again, with considerably more sincerity. Pete came 3 days later with a headache. He described in elaborate and specific terms that suggested he'd been composing the description for at least a day and a half. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which he clearly hadn't expected, and then she asked him 4 questions, and then she gave him a willow bark preparation, and told him to drink water, actual water, not coffee, not whiskey, and to sleep. That's it, he said, staring at the preparation. That's it. No other. Pete, water and sleep. He went. He came back the next morning looking like himself for the first time in days, and told her with great solemnity that it was the best medicine he'd ever had, and she told him that was because it was mostly water and sleep, and he thought about that for a moment, and then decided to take it as a compliment. Hector was last and most deliberate. He came on a Sunday morning, hat in both hands, and he stood in the kitchen doorway without sitting down, and he spoke carefully, in the measured way of a man who has chosen every word in advance. My wife, he said. She is in town. Her hands, the joints, they swell. The cold makes it worse. She has had this for many years. The doctor says there is nothing. Beatrice looked at him for a moment. I can't cure it, she said honestly. But I know how to help her manage the pain and protect the joints. Reduce the swelling on the bad days. She paused. Bring her by when she's comfortable making the trip. On her terms. Hector was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has learned to take accurate measure of people because his circumstances have required it. Then he nodded once slow with a weight and sincerity that was its own form of language. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell, he said. Hector. He looked up. My name is Beatrice. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, something more considered than that. Thank you, Beatrice, he said. Nathan saw all of it. He came home one evening to find Thomas Reed sitting on the porch step very still while Beatrice cleaned a cut above his eyebrow. The boy had walked into a low timber in the dark barn, too embarrassed to explain how, and she was talking to him in her easy, unhurried way, asking him something about where he'd come from before he found the ranch, and Thomas was answering with the openness of someone who had stopped remembering to be guarded about it. Nathan stood at the edge of the porch for longer than he needed to, watching. It wasn't the medical care that arrested him. It was the way she listened. The complete, unperformed quality of her attention. The sense that when Beatrice Holloway was listening to you, nothing else existed in the world that was competing for that attention. He had met people in his life who were skilled at appearing to listen. He had not often met people who actually did it that way, without reservation, without the slight distraction of their own next thought behind their eyes. He made enough noise with his boots to announce himself. Thomas straightened. Beatrice glanced up at him with that level, unsurprised gaze of hers, said evening, and went back to what she was doing. Nathan went inside. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Something in the center of his chest was doing something he had not given it permission to do. He told himself it was gratitude. That she was good for the ranch. That she was managing the household and the hands with a skill he hadn't anticipated, and that was worth noticing. That was all it was. Gratitude. Appreciation for practical competence. He almost believed it. What he knew with more honesty in the place behind the practical reasoning was this. The house felt different. Not fixed up different. Not cleaned up different. Different in a way he hadn't experienced since the last time the house had held a person who genuinely inhabited it, who was present in it, who put her hands on its problems and her warmth into its cold places without being asked. He had been living in a house for 3 years. Beatrice had been here 3 weeks, and it had become quietly, incrementally, and without any announcement, a home. He was not ready to say that out loud, but he knew it. Vivian Ashford had been planning the judge's dinner for 6 weeks. Judge Harlow Crane came through Willow Creek twice a year on his circuit. His visits carried social weight beyond the legal calendar. The families who hosted him, who sat nearest to him at supper, who were remembered in his seasonal correspondence, occupied a position in the town's unspoken hierarchy that everyone understood and no one acknowledged directly. Vivian had hosted the judge's dinner 4 years running. It was hers the way certain things become yours through consistent occupation, not by right, but by force of established expectation. This year she sent an invitation to the Caldwells. The note was in her own handwriting. "The judge so looks forward to meeting Sheriff Caldwell's new bride." The words were perfectly gracious. The intent behind them was something else entirely, and Nathan read it in 2 seconds flat. He handed the note to Beatrice across the supper table. She read it. Her face gave him nothing. "Well," he said. "We should go," she said. "You understand what she's doing?" "Yes." "She's setting a stage," he said, blunter than he usually allowed himself. "She wants an audience, for she wants to make a point in front of the judge." "I know." Beatrice handed the note back. "Nathan, I have walked into harder rooms than Vivian Ashford's dining room." She met his eyes steadily. "I'll be fine. And you need to talk to the judge, or you wouldn't have brought the note to the table." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to prove anything to her." "I'm not planning to prove anything to her," she said. "I'm planning to eat her food and be polite and let her make whatever point she's made up her mind to make." A pause. People who need an audience to make a point generally find that the audience is paying closer attention than they planned on. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then slowly the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the near relative of one. "All right," he said. "Good," she said. "The roast is going cold." He picked up his fork. And this time, when they ate in silence, there was something different in it, something that was warmer and more deliberate, and had the particular texture of two people who have begun without declaring it to be on the same side of something. The night of the dinner came cold and clear. Thomas had the wagon ready before they asked for it cleaned. The horse brushed out the seat blanket, shaken. He held the reins with the quiet pride of someone doing a job the right way, because the people in question deserved it done right. Beatrice came out of the house in a dark green dress. Not fine by Vivian's standards, not trying to be, but neat and clean and wholly hers. And Nathan offered his arm at the foot of the porch steps, and she took it, and they walked to the wagon together, and Thomas kept his eyes very carefully forward. But his jaw was set with the satisfaction of someone who has decided how this evening is going to go, and believes in the rightness of that decision. Inside the Ashford house, the table was set for 12. Crystal. Silver. Candles that cost more than most families spent on food in a week. Vivian had arranged the seating with the precision of a general deploying forces, the judge at the head herself, and Gerald flanking him. The Caldwells placed with a pointed deliberateness at the far end of the table, adjacent to a gap that communicated without a word their position in the order of things. Beatrice sat down without comment. She unfolded her napkin. She looked down the table at Vivian, who was watching her with the bright measuring attention of someone waiting for the first misstep. And she smiled a genuine, unhurried smile, the kind that has no performance in it. And Vivian, unprepared for the genuine article, looked briefly uncertain before recovering. "Mrs. Caldwell," Vivian said, carrying her voice down the table with the practiced projection of a woman accustomed to commanding rooms. "How are you settling into ranch life? I imagine it's quite a change from your previous circumstances." "It suits me," Beatrice said simply. "I've always worked better with my hands than in drawing rooms." A ripple around the table. Vivian's smile stayed in place. "Of course," she said. "There's a certain practicality to that." "There is," Beatrice agreed pleasantly. "Although," Vivian continued, adjusting a fork with one finger, "one does find that community life requires a different kind of skill. Social graces. The ability to read a room, shall we say." "I've read a good many rooms," Beatrice said. Her voice was light. Her eyes were not. "Mining camps, sick rooms, courtrooms. They all have their own grammar." A pause. "I find I manage." Judge Crane, who had been listening with the quiet enjoyment of a man who has seen this particular kind of social chess played many times and is interested to see who wins, made a small sound that might have been a laugh and redirected his attention to the soup. Nathan, seated beside Beatrice, did not look at her. But under the table, his hand found hers for one brief deliberate moment, a pressure, then a release. And it said without words something he didn't yet have the language to say out loud. She did not pull her hand away, but she did not look at him either. And then from outside there was a sound, a horse screaming, then a crash, then worst of all silence, Nathan was out of his chair before the sound had finished. Beatrice was one step behind him. They came through the front door of the Ashford house together, out into the cold October night, and they saw it. Thomas Reed on the frozen ground outside the saloon, his horse rearing and pulling at the hitching post 20 feet away, and Thomas not moving, and one arm bent in a direction that arms are not meant to go. Beatrice was already running. Behind her she heard Vivian call from the doorway. "Someone send for the doctor. Someone send for—" "The doctor is 2 days out," Nathan said, his voice cutting flat and clear. "Everybody stand back." Beatrice hit her knees in the frozen dirt beside Thomas, and her hands were already moving, taking hold of his arm with both of hers, reading the break with her fingers, the way her father had taught her before she was tall enough to see over the examination table. Thomas was conscious, barely, his face white, and his breathing shallow, and his eyes fixed on the sky above him, with the stunned blankness of someone whose body has not yet caught up to what has happened. "Thomas," she said, firm, clear. "Stay with me. Look at me." His eyes found her face. "Mrs. Caldwell." "I've got you," she said. "This is going to hurt. I need you to hold very still." "Is it?" "It's going to be all right," she said. "Hold still." The crowd had gathered in a ring around them. Dinner guests spilling out of the Ashford house, people emerging from the saloon, men from the street, drawn by the horse's scream. They stood in a circle of held breath, nobody moving, nobody speaking, watching the sheriff's wife kneel in the frozen dirt in her dark green dress with both hands on the broken arm of a boy who had no one else. Vivian Ashford stood on the steps of her house. Her hands were clasped at her waist. Her face was doing something complicated that she had not planned for it to do. Beatrice positioned her hands. She looked at Thomas. "Ready?" "No." "Oh," he said honestly. "That's all right," she said. "Take a breath." He did. She pulled. He screamed one raw, short sound that cut across the cold night air, and then went silent, and Beatrice's hands were already moving to stabilize, to hold, to guide the bone, back to where it was meant to be. Her breath controlled, and her grip certain, and every movement made with the precise economy of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what the moment after the worst of it requires. The crowd did not move. The crowd did not breathe. And then Thomas Reed exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and Beatrice sat back on her heels and looked at the arm and looked at Thomas's face and said quietly, "There. The worst is done." Nathan Caldwell crouched down beside her in the frozen dirt. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Beatrice's hands. He looked at her face. And he said in a voice that the whole crowd heard, because the whole crowd had gone completely silent, "Who taught you to set a bone like that?" Beatrice looked up at him. This man who had married her without believing she was anything. This man who had in the last 3 weeks begun to look at her differently, and who was now looking at her with something that had no distance in it at all. "My father," she said. "He was the only doctor in places where people had no one else to turn to." Nathan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked up at the crowd around them, at Vivian Ashford on her steps, at Mavis Hutchins, with one hand pressed to her mouth, at the judge standing in his coat at the edge of the circle, and something in his expression had changed in a way that would take Willow Creek a long time to fully account for. He looked back at Beatrice. "Let's get him inside," he said quietly. "He needs to be warm." "Yes," she said. He put his hand under her arm to help her up. She accepted it, and this time it meant something different than it had at the depot. This time it was not courtesy. It was not a man helping a woman who didn't need it. It was Nathan Caldwell finally beginning to understand exactly what and who he had brought home. The crowd parted without being asked, and Beatrice Holloway walked through it. Thomas Reed's good arm across her shoulders, her dark green dress marked at the knees with the frozen dirt of a street she had just made holy, and not a single person in Willow Creek said a word about her size or her plain dress or where she had come from, because they were all thinking the same thing, though none of them would have put it exactly this way. They had been looking at her wrong from the beginning, and that was a thing that once understood could not be taken back. The night Thomas Reed's arm was set in the frozen street outside the Ashford house, nobody in Willow Creek slept particularly well, not because of Thomas. He was settled by 10 o'clock, his arm bound and splinted his color, returning drinking the willow bark broth Beatrice had prepared with the obedient gratitude of a young man who has been badly frightened and is not too proud to admit it. Not because of the horse which had been caught and calmed and returned to the livery without further incident. They didn't sleep because of what they'd seen. And what they'd seen was something that did not fit inside the framework they had been operating with since the day Beatrice Holloway stepped off the train. Mavis Hutchins sat at her kitchen table at midnight with a cold cup of tea and thought about the expression on Beatrice's face when she'd knelt in the dirt. Not dramatic, not performing courage, just completely and terribly certain, the way a person is certain about something they have done 100 times before. Mavis had spent 3 weeks deciding what kind of woman Beatrice Caldwell was. She was discovering at midnight alone in her kitchen that she had been deciding based on information she had never actually gathered. That was an uncomfortable thing to discover about yourself. Vivian Ashford did not go to her kitchen. She sat in the chair by her bedroom window with the lamp turned low, and she replayed the evening in a specific order, not from the beginning, but from the moment Beatrice hit her knees in the street. The way the crowd had gone silent. The way Nathan had crouched down beside her in the frozen dirt in his good shirt without a moment's hesitation. The way Beatrice had looked up at him when he asked his question, not with triumph, not with vindication, just with the steady openness of someone who has nothing to hide and never did. Vivian had built her social position on the premise that she understood people, that she could read a room and a person and a situation with an accuracy that justified her authority. She sat in her chair in the dark and faced the possibility that she had misread this one entirely, not by accident, but because she had not wanted to look carefully. Because looking carefully would have required her to revise an opinion she'd formed in the first 10 seconds, and Vivian Ashford did not revise. She sat with that for a long time. Nathan carried Thomas to the bunkhouse himself with Hector on the other side, and he came back to the house close to 11 to find Beatrice at the kitchen table, with her father's medical case open in front of her, cleaning the instruments she'd used, returning each one to its place with the methodical care of someone performing a ritual they have done 10,000 times. Her dark green dress was still marked at the knees with the dirt of the street. She hadn't changed yet. She was just sitting there in the quiet with her hands moving through their familiar work and the lamp throwing warm light across her face. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "How is he?" she said without looking up. "Sleeping." He came in and sat down across from her, the same chair Walt had pulled out without asking 3 weeks ago. "Hector's going to check on him through the night." "Good." She folded a length of clean bandage cloth. "The splint needs to stay on for 6 weeks at minimum. He'll fight you on it after 3. "I know." Nathan watched her hands. "Beatrice." She looked up. "Why didn't you tell me," he said, "about your father, about what you know how to do?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just taking her time, the way she always did when she was going to say something true rather than convenient. Because people hear a woman say she can set a bone and treat a wound, and they decide she's either lying or overreaching, she said. "I've had both reactions. They're not useful to anyone." "I wouldn't have—" "You might have," she said not unkindly. "You didn't know me yet." She set the folded cloth in the case. Neither did anyone else. Nathan looked at the table. "I should have asked," he said. "I should have asked you more about who you were, what you'd done." "You asked what you thought to ask," she said. "That's true of most people." "It's not good enough," he said. "Not as it's not what a husband should do." The word husband sat in the air between them, more weighted than it had been before tonight. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. And something passed between them in that kitchen, in the lamplight, in the quiet after a hard night that neither of them named, but that both of them felt with complete clarity. "Get some sleep, Nathan," she said finally softly. He stood. He put his hand on the back of her chair as he passed a brief contact, deliberate, barely anything, and he said, "Thank you for what you did tonight." "It's what I know how to do," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." He went down the hall, and Beatrice sat alone in the kitchen with her father's instruments. For a long time, her hands still the lamp burning low, thinking about a man who had just thanked her not for what she did, but for who she was. It was the first time in her life someone had understood the difference. The next morning hit Willow Creek-like weather. News had traveled the way it always does in small towns, at 10 times the speed of anything useful, arriving ahead of accuracy, arriving ahead of nuance, arriving ahead of the people involved in it. By 8 o'clock, there were 3 different accounts of what had happened in circulation, varying mainly in the level of drama attributed to Beatrice's actions. One version had her fighting the horse. That one was Walt's, and he told it to everyone he encountered in the first 2 hours of the morning, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone describing an event they feel they have a personal stake in. What was consistent across all versions was the essential fact the sheriff's wife had set Thomas Reed's arm in the street outside the Ashford house in front of half the town, and the boy was going to be all right because of it. Beatrice didn't know any of this when she walked into the dry goods store at 9:30. She had a list. She had a purpose. She pulled the door open and stepped inside, and Mavis Hutchins looked up from behind the counter and said, before Beatrice had made it 3 steps into the store, "Mrs. Caldwell." Beatrice stopped. "I owe you an apology," Mavis said. The words came out stiff and uncomfortable, like a garment that didn't fit quite right, but they came out. Mavis's hands were flat on the counter, and her eyes were meeting Beatrice's in a direct, undecorated way that bore no resemblance to the inventory gaze she'd used on every previous visit. Beatrice looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said. "I've been unkind," Mavis said. "I made up my mind about you before I had reason to, and I was unkind about it, and it wasn't right." "No," Beatrice agreed simply. "It wasn't." Mavis blinked, apparently having anticipated either a gracious dismissal or a defensive response, and having received neither. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," Beatrice said. "I accept it." She looked down at her list. "I need flour coffee, and I'm looking for dried chamomile if you have it. For a joint preparation I'm making for Hector's wife." Mavis moved to fill the order, and Beatrice stood at the counter, and the silence between them was different in quality from any silence that had occupied that store before. Not the silence of judgment withheld, but the silence of 2 women starting from a new place, which is a different, cleaner, and considerably more hopeful thing. What Beatrice did not expect was what happened when she turned to leave. Pastor Elias Webb was standing just inside the door. He was a slight, careful man of about 60, with kind eyes and the permanent slight stoop of someone who has spent decades bending toward people in order to hear them properly. He had his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I have something I need to say to you, and I'd rather say it directly than let it get lost." She waited. "I allowed certain conversations to go on in my household about you that I should have stopped," he said. "My wife is a good woman, but she is susceptible to influence, and I did not exercise the judgment I should have when information about you was being passed through my home in a way that wasn't charitable." He held her gaze with the discomfort of a man doing something his conscience requires, but his nature finds difficult. "I'm sorry for that. I appreciate you saying so, Pastor," she said. "What you did last night is what I was taught to do," she said. "It doesn't require a testament." "No," he said, "but the way you did it does." He put his hat back on. "You're welcome in this church, Mrs. Caldwell. I want you to know that." "I've always considered myself welcome in churches," she said mildly. "I just haven't been certain the churches knew it." Webb blinked. Then he did something she hadn't expected from him. He laughed. A short, genuine sound. "Fair enough," he said. She stepped past him into the morning, and the list of things she had anticipated from this day did not include any of what had just happened, and she held that quietly, the way you hold something unexpected and good carefully, not wanting to examine it too hard in case it changes. Thomas Reed was up by mid-morning, which was not what Beatrice had told him to do, and she found him in the barn, attempting to carry a saddle with one arm, and looking aggressively unconcerned when she appeared in the doorway. "Put that down," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Thomas, you are going to put that saddle down," she said, in the precise tone she had heard her father use exactly once on a miner who had tried to get up 6 hours after having a bullet removed from his shoulder. "Or I am going to put it down for you. and then I am going to nail that splint to your arm personally, and I will not be gentle about it." Thomas put the saddle down. "Sit," she said. He sat on a hay bale with the expression of a young man who is 20 years old and has just been thoroughly handled by a woman half a foot shorter than him, and is not entirely sure how that happened. She checked the splint. The wrapping had loosened slightly from his attempt at the saddle. She retightened it, her hands efficient and firm, while Thomas sat perfectly still and stared at the barn wall. "How's the pain?" she asked. "Tolerable." "On a scale." He sighed. 6. "Drink the rest of the broth I left on the bunkhouse table. All of it, not some of it." "Yes, ma'am." "And Thomas." She finished with the splint and looked at him directly. "You are 20 years old. You have the rest of your life to carry saddles. You have 6 weeks to let this heal correctly. If you don't let it heal correctly, you'll be carrying saddles wrong for the rest of your life." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He looked at her. Something in his face had shifted from the mild embarrassment of being scolded to something younger and more honest. "My pa," he said. "He broke his arm when I was 12. Didn't let it heal right. He still can't. His right hand don't close all the way." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm telling you." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know about his hand?" "I didn't," she said. "But you just told me why this matters to you, and now you'll actually rest." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just been seen with more accuracy than they expected. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And this time, he meant it all the way down. Beatrice left the barn and found Nathan leaning against the fence post outside, having apparently been there long enough to have heard at least the last portion of that conversation, because his expression had the specific quality of a man who is trying to look like he hasn't just witnessed something that moved him. "She's going to be all right," Beatrice said, not stopping as she passed him. "Beatrice," he said. She stopped, turned. "I talked to Judge Crane this morning," he said, before he left. She waited. "He asked about you." Nathan's jaw moved. Not in a, he wasn't asking to be unkind. He wanted to know if you had formal training, if you'd ever considered practicing more officially. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd pass it along." He looked at her steadily. "Would you consider it? There's a territorial board. It's not a full medical degree, but there's a certification for frontier healers. It would give you standing, legal standing. You could charge for your services, turn away anyone who—" "Nathan." Her voice was gentle but clear. "My father never had a certificate. He saved more lives than most men with certificates." "I know that," he said. "That's not what I'm—" He stopped, tried again. "If you had the certification, nobody could question your right to practice. Nobody could tell you to stop. I'd like for you to have the protection." She looked at him for a long moment. I was not trying to manage her. She understood that. He was trying to build a wall between her and the world's ability to dismiss what she could do, and the impulse behind it was not control. It was something much more tender than that, and much more honest, and she recognized it with a clarity that was both warm and slightly frightening. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He looked like a man who has said something important and is not entirely sure it landed the way he meant it. "That's all I'm asking," he said. She turned and walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard him exhale slow and deliberate the way a man breathes when he has been holding more than he realized. She did not turn around, but she was smiling just slightly in a way she was fairly certain he couldn't see. Vivian Ashford came to the ranch that afternoon. Nobody had expected that. Beatrice heard the horse on the drive and came to the door, and there was Vivian Ashford, sitting straight in the saddle, in a dark riding coat. Her hair perfect. Her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has made a decision she is committed to, regardless of the personal cost. She dismounted without assistance. She walked to the porch steps. She stood at the bottom of them and looked up at Beatrice in the doorway. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "Mrs. Ashford." A silence. "May I come in?" Vivian asked. It was the first time in any interaction Beatrice could remember that Vivian had asked for something rather than assuming it. "Yes," Beatrice said. She stepped back from the doorway. Vivian came in. She looked at the kitchen clean, warm, organized with the practical efficiency of someone who uses a space rather than displaying it, and she did not comment on any of it, which was itself a kind of comment. She took the chair Beatrice indicated without adjusting it or looking at it. She folded her hands on the table. "I was planning to humiliate you last night," she said. Beatrice sat down across from her. "I know. I had designed the evening specifically to demonstrate." Vivian stopped. The words apparently were not as easy as she had expected. "To demonstrate that you didn't belong." "In Willow Creek?" Beatrice asked. "In the position you occupy," Vivian said. "As Nathan Caldwell's wife, I felt that you were not—" She stopped again. Her hands on the table were not entirely still. "I had a picture in my mind of what his wife should be, and you did not fit it, and I decided before I ever spoke a word to you that you were wrong for it." "And now?" Beatrice asked. Vivian looked at her directly, with the controlled discomfort of a woman who does not find honesty naturally easy, but has decided to practice it anyway. "Now I am sitting in your kitchen," she said, "having ridden out here to tell you that I was wrong, and that what I saw last night, the way you handled that boy, the way you held yourself." She paused. "I have spent many years deciding what kind of women deserve respect in this town. I made that decision about you without information. That was wrong." The room was very quiet. "Mrs. Ashford," Beatrice said, "can I ask you something?" "You may." "Why did you come yourself?" Beatrice said. "You could have sent a note. You could have let it go. Most people would have let it go. Why did you come?" Vivian looked at her for a moment, and then something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, but opening. A layer removed. "Because my daughter is 14 years old," she said. "And she watched what you did last night from the window of the Ashford house. And when we got home, she asked me—" Vivian stopped. Her hands tightened briefly. "She asked me why I had been unkind to you. She had heard the things I said. Children hear everything." A beat. "And I found I could not answer her in a way I was proud of." Beatrice was quiet. "So I'm here," Vivian said. "Not because it's comfortable. Because my daughter deserved to see me do it." There was a long silence in the kitchen. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the long dry way of October. "Mrs. Ashford," Beatrice said, "your daughter sounds like a fine young woman." "She is," Vivian said. Her voice for the first time had no armor in it at all. "She's considerably finer than her mother, I suspect." "Most daughters are," Beatrice said. "That's usually the point." Vivian looked at her, and something happened that neither of them would have predicted 12 hours earlier. Vivian Ashford smiled. A real one with no performance behind it, the kind that changes the whole face. "I suspect you and I have gotten off to a poor start," she said. "I suspect we have," Beatrice agreed. "We could try again if you're willing." "I am," Vivian said. Beatrice rose and went to the stove and put water on for coffee. And Vivian Ashford, the woman who had spent 6 weeks building a stage designed to demonstrate that Beatrice Caldwell did not belong, sat at Beatrice's kitchen table and waited for coffee. Like a woman who had just after considerable resistance arrived somewhere she should have come to sooner. Nathan found them there an hour later, still at the table, voices low, conversation going, and he stood in the doorway of his own kitchen with an expression that moved through surprise and settled somewhere much quieter, and he did not interrupt them. I went back outside. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the land going gold in the afternoon light, and he thought about a woman who had walked into a town that had decided against her before she arrived and had one person at a time, without argument, without surrender, without a single moment of performing anything other than exactly who she was, changed her mind. He thought about his own mind. How long it had been since he'd allowed himself to want something. How efficiently he'd built the internal architecture of not wanting, and how quietly, steadily, without his permission, Beatrice had been dismantling it, not by trying to, but simply by being consistently, genuinely, irreducibly herself. He heard her laugh from inside the kitchen. He had not heard her laugh like that before, easy, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who is comfortable where she is. It went through him like the first warm day after a long winter, unexpected and total. He stood on the porch for another minute. Then he went back inside because he had decided somewhere between hearing her laugh and walking to the door that he was done standing outside, things he was afraid to want. He came into the kitchen. Both women looked up. He registered Vivian's presence with a brief, unreadable expression, then looked at Beatrice. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said. "When Mrs. Ashford is done." "I should be getting back," Vivian said, already rising, reading the room with the social accuracy that was whatever else could be said about her genuinely sharp. She looked at Beatrice. "Thank you for the coffee." "Thank you for coming," Beatrice said. They held each other's gaze for a moment. Two women who had just decided without quite stating it that something between them had been repaired and that they were both willing to see what could be built in its place. Vivian let herself out. They heard her horse move off down the drive. Nathan sat down in the chair she'd vacated. He put his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment he just looked at Beatrice across the table with the expression of a man working up to something. "There's a room," he said, "off the east side of the house. I've been using it to store tack and old equipment. It's not large, but it's solid. Good light from the east window in the mornings." He stopped. "I want to clear it out. Build you a proper workbench, shelving for your supplies." He looked at her steadily. "A medical room. Proper. Where you can see people and work without doing it at the kitchen table." Beatrice looked at him. "You're going to keep doing it anyway," he said. "People are going to keep coming. Word's going to get out further than it already has. I'd rather you had a place that was yours. A real place, not a corner of the kitchen." She was quiet for long enough that he seemed to doubt himself. She watched the doubt move across his face, the slight tightening around the eyes of a man who has offered something and is not sure it landed right. "Nathan," she said. "If you'd rather not, that's—" "Nathan," she said again, quieter and more direct. "That is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." He looked at her. The doubt cleared. Something warmer replaced it, something unguarded and genuine, and he looked in that moment like a man who has been standing outside in the cold for longer than he realizes and has just stepped into somewhere warm. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. He picked up his hat. He stood, and he paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at her, this woman who had arrived on a late train 3 weeks ago with a heavy trunk and steady eyes, and who had in that time rebuilt something in him he had told himself was gone. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes." He seemed for a moment to weigh words he didn't have exactly right yet. "I'm glad you came," he said finally. "I want you to know that. Whatever I did or didn't say at the beginning, I'm glad you came." She held his gaze across the kitchen. "So am I," she said quietly. He nodded. He went out, and Beatrice sat at the table in the warm kitchen of a house that was becoming hers in ways she had not expected in a town that was slowly, grudgingly, and then more willingly, beginning to make room for who she actually was, and she felt something she had been carrying for a very long time begin carefully and tentatively to set itself down. It was not safety exactly. It was not certainty. It was the feeling of someone who has moved their whole life, finally recognizing in the particular quality of afternoon light, through a window, in the weight of a conversation, just concluded in the words of a man who didn't know yet what he was saying, but meant every word of it. The feeling of someone who has found at last a place worth staying. And Willow Creek, for its part, was only beginning to understand what it had in Beatrice Holloway Caldwell. Because 3 days later, something happened that would test all of it. The trust she had built, the alliances that were forming Nathan's faith in her, and Beatrice's own certainty about who she was and what she had come here to do, in ways none of them had seen coming. 3 days later, Gerald Ashford's books were found to be missing $40,000. And the finger in the first terrible hour of that discovery pointed directly at the ranch. The $40,000 had been gone for at least 3 weeks before Gerald Ashford discovered it. He found the discrepancy on a Tuesday morning sitting at his desk with the quarterly ledgers spread in front of him, and the first thing he did was go through every column twice because he was certain he had made an arithmetic error. He was not a man who made arithmetic errors. He had built his business on numbers, and numbers had never lied to him the way people did. The numbers were not lying now. $40,000. Gone from the grain cooperative account, drawn out in 4 separate withdrawals across 6 weeks. Each one documented with his signature, his seal, his authorization. Except that Gerald Ashford had not authorized any of them, had not signed any of them, had not in fact been aware any of them existed until this Tuesday morning, when the quarterly ledger told him otherwise. He sat at his desk for 20 minutes without moving. Then he walked downstairs, told his clerk to close the store, and went to find Nathan Caldwell. Nathan was at the livery when Gerald found him talking to the stable hand about a horse that had thrown a shoe. He read Gerald's face before Gerald said a word. 20 years of law enforcement had given him a precise fluency in the faces of men delivering bad news, and he told the stable hand they'd finish later and walked Gerald outside. "Tell me," he said. Gerald told him. Nathan listened without interrupting, which was a skill he'd developed over years, and which Gerald appeared to find both reassuring and slightly unnerving. When Gerald finished, Nathan asked 3 questions. How long ago were the withdrawals? Who at the cooperative had signing authority beside Gerald? And had Gerald spoken to anyone else before coming here? Gerald answered 6 weeks back, to around the time of the judge's visit. 2 other people had secondary signing authority. His chief clerk, a man named Aldous Breen, and the cooperative's founding partner, a rancher named Dale Mercer, who operated the largest cattle operation 20 miles east of Willow Creek. And no, Gerald had not spoken to anyone else. "I need you to keep it that way," Nathan said. "For now. Don't speak to Breen. Don't speak to Mercer. Go back to your office and sit on this until I come to you." "Nathan." Gerald's voice was tight. $40,000. "I know. That is everything the cooperative has built since—" "Gerald." Nathan put a hand on the man's shoulder, firm and direct. "I know what it is. Go back to your office. Let me work." Gerald went. Nathan stood in the street for a moment, and then he walked back to the ranch, and he was still working through the pieces when he came through the kitchen door, and found Beatrice at the workbench he'd built her in the east room, grinding doorway, and said, "I need to think out loud. Do you have a minute?" She set down the pestle. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He told her everything Gerald had told him in the same precise, unembellished way he'd listened to it. Facts first, implications after, questions last. He had started doing this with her 3 days ago, without making a conscious decision to. And he had noticed that she listened to him the same way she listened to her patients, with her whole attention, without planning her response, while he was still talking in a way that made him say things more clearly than he would have said them otherwise. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Who benefits?" she said. "That's the question." "The money went somewhere," she said. 6 weeks of cooperative funds. That's not petty theft. That's someone with a plan. She looked at him. "Who has a plan in this town?" Nathan looked at the table. He had been running the same question and arriving at the same answer and not liking it. "Dale Mercer has been trying to buy out 3 of the smaller ranches in the cooperative for 2 years, he said. If the cooperative collapses financially, those ranches go under. He picks them up at distressed prices. "And does Mercer have access to the cooperative's accounts?" "Secondary signing authority," Nathan said. "Technically limited. But if someone got hold of Gerald's seal, or forged his signature," Beatrice said. "Yes." She was quiet again in that way of hers that was not absence but active. He watched her think, and had the same sensation he'd had since the beginning, that there was a great deal happening behind those steady eyes that she was considering carefully before it became words. "Nathan," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. 2 weeks ago," she said. "A man came to the East Room. Said he was a traveler passing through, needed something for a stomach complaint. I treated him." She paused. "He asked questions while I was working, about the ranch, about you, about how long we'd been married. I thought at the time it was just conversation. People talk when they're nervous." She met his eyes. "He asked specifically whether Nathan Caldwell was a man who kept records, whether you had files on your ranch operations, whether you had a safe." The kitchen went very still. "What did he look like?" Nathan asked. She described him. lean, mid-40s, a scar through his left eyebrow, spoke with the particular cadence of someone who had spent time in Kansas City. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Rains," he said. "You know him. Dale Mercer's hired man." Nathan stood up from the table. "He's been with Mercer for 3 years. Mercer uses him to handle things he doesn't want to be personally associated with." He put his hat on. "Beatrice, he was in this house." "In the East Room," she said. "Not past it." "He was asking about a safe." "There isn't one," she said. "Mercer doesn't know that." Nathan's voice had gone flat in the particular way of a man who is controlling anger with precision. "If Raines reported back that I had records, financial records, land records, Mercer could use that. If the cooperative money goes missing and someone needs a place to point a ranch with records and a safe is a convenient target," Beatrice said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the kitchen. "How long do you have before this gets out?" she asked. "Gerald's a careful man, but this town doesn't stay quiet long. A day, maybe 2. Then you need the cooperative's real records before Mercer has time to move anything else," she said. She stood. "Nathan, Aldous Breen the clerk. Is he Mercer's man or Gerald's? I don't know. You need to know before you walk into that office," she said. "Because if he's Mercer's man, anything you ask for is going straight back to Mercer." She was already moving, reaching for her coat on the hook by the door. "Take me with you." He blinked. "To Ashford's office. To Vivian," she said. "Vivian knows every person in this town's allegiances better than anyone alive. She built her social position on knowing exactly who is loyal to whom. If anyone can tell you whether Breen is clean, it's her." Nathan looked at her for a moment. This woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago as a practical solution to an empty house, and who was standing in his kitchen doorway, with her coat half on, and her mind 3 steps ahead of his, and he felt something that was pride, and something that was more than pride, and something he still didn't have the exact word for. "Let's go," he said. Vivian received them in her sitting room without apparent surprise, as though Nathan Caldwell arriving at her door with his wife, and an expression like a closed fist, was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday occurrence. She listened to what Nathan told her, the abbreviated version. The version that established the problem without revealing all of what he knew, and when he finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Aldous Breen is Gerald's man entirely," she said. "He's worked for Gerald since before the cooperative existed. His wife's family are founding members. If Breen is involved in this, I will eat my best hat." She paused. "Dale Mercer, on the other hand, has been trying to acquire land in this county for longer than anyone gives him credit for. He's patient, methodical. He doesn't move quickly." She looked at Nathan directly. "He's been particularly interested in your eastern pasture land." Nathan went very still. "My land isn't for sale." "He knows that," Vivian said, "which is why he wouldn't approach you directly." She glanced at Beatrice. "A sheriff who appears to be implicated in a financial fraud, even a cleared one, is a sheriff who loses standing. A sheriff who loses standing in a territorial land dispute is a much easier obstacle to work around." "He's not just after the cooperative money," Nathan said. "I don't think the cooperative money is the point at all," Vivian said. "I think it's the mechanism. He needs the cooperative to collapse. He needs the smaller ranches to default. And he needs you occupied, discredited, or both." She said it with the flat, unemotional certainty of someone who has thought clearly about how power operates and is not inclined to dress it up. "The question is what you do in the next 48 hours. "I need proof," Nathan said. "You need the transfer documents," Vivian said. "The originals. If Mercer forged Gerald's signature, there will be something wrong with it. Gerald signs with a very particular hand. He had a hand injury 20 years ago, and it changed the way he forms certain letters. I've seen his signature hundreds of times." She looked at Beatrice. "Would you recognize a forged signature if you knew what to look for?" "Show me Gerald's real signature," Beatrice said, "and I'll tell you." Vivian rose and went to her husband's desk without hesitation, pulled a drawer, and produced a letter with Gerald's signature at the bottom. She handed it to Beatrice. Beatrice studied it for a long moment. "The capital G breaks left before it closes," she said. And the final D has a particular tail. It goes under the line, not above. Yes, Vivian said. I'll recognize it, Beatrice said. She handed the letter back. Nathan watched this exchange with the specific expression of a man who is rapidly revising his understanding of what his life is going to look like. I'll get the transfer documents from Breen, he said. Today before the end of business. And I, Vivian said, settling back into her chair with the composure of someone who has just decided to enter a war on a specific side. We'll have a conversation with 3 members of the cooperative board this afternoon, casually, in passing. She looked at Nathan steadily. By tomorrow morning, the board will be asking questions that make it very difficult for anyone to move money or records without it being noticed. Vivian, Nathan said, I need to ask you something directly. Then ask it. Why are you doing this? She held his gaze without flinching. Because Gerald built that cooperative with 20 years of his life, she said. And because... A brief pause, and in it something genuine moved across her face. And because your wife came to my house last night and had coffee with me after I spent 6 weeks trying to destroy her reputation, and she was kind to me. And I have found to my own surprise that I would like to be the kind of woman who deserves that kindness. She looked at Beatrice. This is what I can do. The room was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Beatrice said simply. They left Vivian's house with a plan, and the plan held together for almost exactly 16 hours. Nathan got the transfer documents from Breen before 3 o'clock. Breen, who was indeed in... Gerald's man turned pale when Nathan explained what he was looking at, went through his files with shaking hands, and produced 4 documents that he had assumed as the cooperative clerk were entirely legitimate. He had processed them himself. He had no reason to question Gerald's signature. Nathan brought the documents home. He laid them on Beatrice's workbench under the East Room's good morning light, and she bent over them with the same focused precision she brought to medical work. And inside 4 minutes, she looked up and said, The G breaks right, not left, and the tail on the D goes above the line. You're certain? Every one of them, she said. Whoever signed these has a very good imitation of Gerald's hand, but not good enough. She looked at him. You have your forgery. Nathan stood there for a moment with the documents in his hand, and the case essentially built in his mind, and he thought briefly with the clarity that comes when pieces fall into place that it was going to be all right. That he had what he needed. That Mercer had overreached and left evidence and Nathan had it in his hands. I thought that for approximately 6 hours. At 9 o'clock that night, Walt came to the house at a dead run, the first time anyone had seen Walt run in living memory, and he came through the back door without knocking and said, breathing hard, Mercer's man Raines was just at the telegraph office. Sent a wire. Half hour ago. I saw him go in. Nathan stood up from the table. To who? Don't know the name, Walt said. But I know the clerk. And I know the clerk owes me from that poker game in April. He held out a folded piece of paper. He made me a copy. Nathan took it. He read it. His face went flat and still in the way Beatrice had learned meant he was containing something large. He handed it to her without a word. She read it. The wire was addressed to a name she didn't recognize. A name that meant nothing to her, and it said in the abbreviated language of telegraph communication, Move on the Caldwell land records tonight, before morning. They're coming here, she said. Tonight, Nathan said. For records that don't exist, she said. They don't know that. He was already moving, going for his gun belt on the hook by the door. I need to get Hector and Caleb and... Nathan! Her voice stopped him. If Raines comes here tonight with enough men to search this property, you're looking at a confrontation that even if you win, it becomes a story about the sheriff having a fight on his own ranch. Mercer will use that. She was thinking out loud, the words coming with the same focused efficiency as her hands on a difficult injury. You don't want to fight here. You want Mercer to come to you. He turned. What are you saying? I'm saying that right now Mercer thinks he still has time. He thinks you don't know about the wire. He thinks Raines can get to your property tonight and find what he's looking for. She met Nathan's eyes steadily. What if instead of stopping Raines from coming, you let him come and you're ready for him? The room was very quiet. Walt looked between them with the expression of a man watching a chess game being played at a speed he can follow but could not have initiated. "If Rains enters this property tonight without authorization," Nathan said slowly, "that's criminal trespass. If I catch him in the act—" "You have him," Beatrice said. "And Rains is not a man who takes a fall by himself. He'll give you Mercer." Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway with his gun belt in his hand and looked at his wife. This woman who had arrived on a late train with a heavy trunk and steady eyes, who had in the space of 3 weeks rebuilt his household, rebuilt his relationships with his hands, rebuilt bridges he hadn't known were burned, who had sat across a table from Vivian Ashford and turned an enemy into an ally through nothing but the consistent force of who she was, and who was now in his kitchen on a Tuesday night, calmly laying out a plan that had a better chance of working than anything his 20 years of law enforcement had produced in the first 10 minutes of this crisis. "All right," he said quietly. They were ready by 10 o'clock. Hector and Caleb stationed themselves in the barn with a clear line to the east side of the house. Thomas, whose splinted arm did not prevent him from sitting very still in the dark and being observant, was posted near the fence with instructions to signal the moment he saw anyone on the drive. Walt, who had declared himself too old to run, but entirely capable of shooting, took the back porch. Nathan was inside with the documents on the table waiting. Beatrice was beside him. He had told her to go to the bedroom, and she had looked at him with an expression that communicated with no words required that this was not something she was going to do. He had looked back at her for 3 seconds and decided that arguing would take longer than accepting, and he accepted. They sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and they did not speak because there was nothing that needed saying right now that hadn't already been said. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who are, without having made a formal declaration of it, entirely on the same side of something. At 11:15, Thomas's signal came, a low whistle, 2 notes the way Nathan had shown him. Then another. 2 men on the drive. Nathan reached across the table in the dark, and for a moment his hand covered Beatrice's. A brief pressure. She turned her hand over and pressed back, and then he stood and moved to the side of the kitchen door, and everything that happened next happened very fast. Rains came through the east room window. The room Beatrice had rebuilt as her medical space, the room Nathan had built the shelving for, the room that was the most concrete and physical thing Nathan had done to tell her that this was her home, and her work mattered. And Nathan was through the door before Rains had his second foot on the floor. What followed was not long, and it was not complicated, and it was not in the end a fight. Rains was fast, but Nathan was faster and angrier, and had the particular focused anger of a man defending something that belongs to him. Rains went down. The second man, halfway through the window behind him, saw what happened to Rains and made a decision that was entirely correct, which was to go back out the way he came and run. He ran directly into Hector, which was not what he had been expecting. Caleb got the horses. It was over in 6 minutes. Rains sat on the east room floor with his hands bound, and Nathan crouching in front of him, with a face like something carved from cold stone, and Nathan said very quietly, "You have one opportunity to make this better for yourself. You are going to tell me exactly what Dale Mercer asked you to do, and when and how. All of it. And you are going to tell me now." Rains looked at him. He looked at the bound hands. He looked at Hector in the doorway. He looked at Walt on the back porch, who was holding a rifle with the particular ease of someone who has had a great deal of practice and is not concerned about the current situation. Then he looked at Beatrice, who was standing in the corner of her medical room with her arms crossed and her eyes steady, and who looked like someone who had seen harder things than this and had not flinched at any of them. Rains was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked for 40 minutes without stopping. And what he described was methodical and cold, and considerably larger than $40,000. Mercer had been building toward this for 2 years. The cooperative money was the first move designed to collapse the smaller ranches, which would default on their land notes, which Mercer had quietly been buying up through a land agent operating out of Pueblo. The forgery was meant to implicate Gerald Ashford himself, removing him from any position of authority in the cooperative. And the search of Nathan's ranch was meant to find or plant evidence connecting the sheriff to the financial irregularities, removing the one person in Willow Creek with the legal standing to stop Mercer from completing the acquisition. The eastern pasture that Mercer wanted from Nathan's ranch sat directly on the water rights corridor. Whoever controlled that corridor controlled water access for 6 other ranches. Mercer didn't need to buy those ranches. He just needed to own what they couldn't function without. By the time Rains finished, Nathan had everything he needed. He stood up. He looked at Hector. "Lock him in the tack room," he said. "I'm riding for the territorial marshal in the morning." "Nathan!" Beatrice's voice from the corner. He turned. She was looking at him with those steady dark eyes, and there was something in them that he had not seen there before. Not worry exactly, but the close relative of it. The look of someone who has been holding something carefully and is deciding whether to put it down. "Mercer is going to know by morning," she said. "When Rains doesn't come back, and the second man does, I know. He may run." "He won't run," Nathan said. "Mercer's not a man who runs. He's a man who has a contingency, and I need to get to the marshal before he executes it." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. "I'll be back by tomorrow night." She looked up at him. "You'll be safe," he said. "Hector, Walt, Thomas, Caleb and Pete. All of them are here." "I'm not worried about safe," she said. "What are you worried about?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected in a voice that was quieter than her usual voice. The voice she used when she was saying something that cost her something to say. "I'm worried that when this is over, everything goes back to what it was." She held his gaze. "That you go back to being the man who married a practical solution. And I go back to being exactly that." The east room was very quiet. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Walt, still visible in the doorway behind her, made the decision to find somewhere else to be, because Walt was many things, but he was not a fool. "Beatrice," Nathan said. "You don't have to. I need to say this," he said. "So let me say it." He took a breath. "I have not thought of you as a practical solution since about the 3rd day you were here. Possibly earlier than that, but I was being stubborn about it." He held her gaze with the direct, undeflected steadiness of a man who has decided to stop standing outside what he wants. "When I get back from the marshal, I'd like to talk to you about that, properly, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm willing," she said quietly. He nodded. He put his hat on. He turned to go, and then he stopped, and he did something that surprised both of them. He reached back and tucked a strand of her loose hair behind her ear, a gesture so small and so deliberate, and so unlike anything he had done in the 5 weeks since she arrived, that it landed between them with the weight of something much larger. He went out, and Beatrice stood in the east room of her house, the room he had built for her, the room she had filled with her father's instruments, and her own knowledge, and the proof that she was exactly who she had always been. And she listened to his horse leave the yard, and she held the feeling of his hand against her hair like something she intended to carry. Outside, Walt appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the direction Nathan had ridden. He looked back at her. "Well," he said with the satisfaction of a man whose shoulder has been healed and who has decided that entitles him to certain opinions. "Took him long enough." "Walt," she said. "Ma'am." "Go check on Thomas." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he went, and she heard him chuckling all the way across the yard, and she found to her own considerable surprise that she was smiling. It had taken 5 weeks and a financial conspiracy and a man on her floor with bound hands and 40 minutes of testimony to get here. But here was a very good place to be. Nathan rode out before dawn, and the ranch held its breath. That was how Walt described it later, that the whole property went quieter than usual, the way animals go quiet before weather. Except the weather. In this case was the particular tension of waiting for something large to resolve itself. Hector kept to his routines with the deliberate steadiness of a man who understands that routine is its own form of reassurance. Caleb and Pete worked the fence line without their usual argument about who was doing more of it. Thomas sat on the bunkhouse step in the morning cold with his splinted arm across his knees and watched the drive with the focused attention of a young man who has decided he is going to be useful regardless of his limitations. Beatrice was in the East Room by 6 o'clock. She had not slept well, which she would not have admitted to anyone, and she dealt with the not sleeping the way she dealt with most things, by finding work that needed doing and doing it. She reorganized her tincture shelf. She cataloged the bandage cloth. She wrote out in her careful hand the preparation instructions for Hector's wife's joint treatment, because Rosa was coming on Thursday and Beatrice wanted everything ready. She kept her hands busy, because her hands, when they were busy, kept the rest of her from going to places that weren't useful. She was thinking about what Nathan had said before he wrote out, "When I get back from the marshal, I'd like to talk to you about that. Properly." She was 34 years old, no 26. She had lived her whole life in motion, arriving and leaving, and she had learned to be careful about wanting things that required staying. She had learned to hold good things loosely, because loosely held things hurt less when they were taken away. But Nathan Caldwell had reached back in the dark and tucked her hair behind her ear, and she was finding it very difficult to hold that loosely. She was still in the East Room at 8 o'clock when she heard a horse on the drive that was not Nathan's. She knew Nathan's horse by sound, now the particular rhythm of that animal's trot, the way it favored its right front slightly on hard ground. This was not that sound. She came to the doorway and saw Dale Mercer. She had never met Dale Mercer. She knew him by description, mid-50s, heavy-set, the particular confidence of a man who has spent decades being the largest economic force in any room he enters. He matched the description precisely. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard, with the ease of someone who has not yet been told that his plan has failed, which meant the second man, the one who had run from Hector in the dark, had not made it back to Mercer, or had made it back and told a version that left certain details out. Mercer looked at her standing in the doorway of the East Room. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that has been used a great many times to put people at ease before something unpleasant. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "is the sheriff in?" "He is not," she said. "Expected back soon?" "I couldn't say." Mercer swung down from his horse with the ease of a man in no hurry. "Mind if I wait? I have some cooperative business to discuss with him. Shouldn't take long." Beatrice looked at him steadily. In her medical experience, which covered a considerable range of human behavior under pressure, she had developed a reliable sense for the difference between a man who was uncertain and a man who was performing certainty. Mercer was performing. He didn't know what had happened to Rains, but he suspected something had gone wrong, and he had come here to assess the damage before deciding his next move. "You're welcome to wait," she said. "Come inside." She said it without hesitation, without any signal that she understood what his presence meant, because she had spent last night working through exactly this possibility that Mercer would come before Nathan returned, and she had made certain decisions about how she would handle it if he did. She put coffee on. She set a cup in front of him at the kitchen table. She sat across from him and folded her hands and looked at him with the same attentive, unhurried expression she used when she was letting a patient talk themselves toward the truth of what was actually wrong. Mercer tried the smile again. "I've been meaning to come and welcome you properly," he said. "I heard about what you did for young Thomas Reed. That was quite something." "He's doing well," she said. "Your father was a healer, I understand." "He was. Remarkable skill to pass on." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I imagine it must have been quite a life traveling the way you did, never settling anywhere long." "It had its challenges," she said. "A woman like you deserves somewhere to put down roots," he said. The smile was still in place, but there was something underneath it now, a pressure and assessment. He was looking at her the way he looked at land, trying to identify the value and the vulnerability simultaneously. "I imagine you'd like to feel secure here, permanent." "I already do," she said. Something flickered in his eyes. "Of course," he said. "Of course you do." He turned his coffee cup. "Although, and I say this as a friend to Nathan, I've known him a long time, this territory has a way of being uncertain. Land disputes, financial complications. A man in Nathan's position, with the sheriff's responsibilities and the ranch to run." He shook his head with what was meant to look like concerned sympathy. "It's a great deal of pressure, for both of you." Beatrice looked at him for a moment. Mr. Mercer, she said. Can I ask you something directly? He opened his hands. Please. Are you here about Rains? The coffee cup stopped moving. The smile didn't disappear. He was too controlled for that. But it changed quality entirely, the way a fire changes when something green goes on it. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. I don't know what you mean, he said. I think you do, she said. I think you sent Rains here last night, and you haven't heard from him, and you came here this morning to understand why. She held his gaze with complete steadiness. He's in our tack room, Mr. Mercer. Nathan left for the territorial marshal before dawn. The kitchen went very quiet. Mercer set down his coffee cup. Something had shifted in him. The performance of ease had dropped, and what was underneath it was neither warm nor uncertain. It was the face of a man who has played a long game and is doing rapid calculations about whether the game is salvageable. That's a serious accusation, he said. His voice was flat now, no more warmth in it. It's a statement of fact, she said. Your man broke into this property last night. He's been in custody since 11:15. He's been talking since about midnight. She paused. He had quite a lot to say about cooperative account transfers and forged signatures and water rights corridors. Mercer was very still. You should know, she continued in the same even voice, that Nathan has the original transfer documents. I compared the signatures myself. Gerald Ashford signs his G with a break to the left. Yours breaks right. All 4 documents. She let that sit for a moment. That's forgery, Mr. Mercer. That's a territorial crime. He stood up from the table. He was a large man, and he used his size the way men sometimes do when they are running out of other options, putting it in the room as its own kind of argument. You're Nathan Caldwell's wife, he said. You've been here 6 weeks. You have no idea how this territory works. You have no idea what land means out here, or what it costs, or what a man has to do to. Sit down, Mr. Mercer. He stopped. The words had come out of Beatrice Holloway Caldwell with a quietness and a weight that were not proportional to her volume, and were entirely disproportionate to the expectation of a woman sitting across a kitchen table. She had used this voice exactly once before on a mining camp foreman who had tried to stop her treating an injured worker because the worker owed the foreman money. The foreman had sat down too. Mercer sat. I know what land means, she said. I've been in places where men died for land. I've set the bones of men who were beaten for land. I've sat with people in the last hours of their lives because someone decided their land was worth more than they were. She looked at him with eyes that had none of the warmth she extended to people who deserved it. What you did wasn't about land. It was about deciding that the people already on that land were worth less than what you wanted from them. That Gerald Ashford's 20 years didn't matter. That 3 families' livelihoods didn't matter. That Nathan's reputation and this ranch and everyone on it didn't matter. She leaned forward slightly. I have spent my whole life watching people decide that other people don't matter. I have very little patience for it. Mercer stared at her. He had come here expecting he was not certain what he had expected. A worried wife. Someone he could reassure or manage or move. He had not expected this. He had made the same error half of Willow Creek had made 6 weeks ago, which was to look at Beatrice Caldwell and see what was easiest to see and stop there. What do you want? He said. His voice had the careful quality of a man reassessing everything. I don't want anything from you, she said. Nathan will be back with the marshal tomorrow morning. What happens after that isn't in my hands. She stood and took his coffee cup and put it in the wash basin. I'd suggest you spend the time between now and then thinking carefully about whether there's a version of this where you do some right by the people you harmed. Because I've seen men face territorial courts, Mr. Mercer. The ones who cooperated early generally kept more of their lives than the ones who didn't. He stood slowly. He put his hat on. He looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not respect, not exactly, but the close relative of it. The look of a man who has just encountered something he did not account for in his calculations and is being honest with himself about it. You're not what I expected, he said. No, she said. I rarely am. He went. Beatrice stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out of the yard, and she waited until he was fully off the property before she let herself breathe all the way out. Then she went to the east room and sat down on the stool at her workbench and put her hands flat on the surface and held them there until they were steady. Hector appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. He had seen Mercer arrive, and he had made the decision to stay close to the house, and now he was looking at her with the expression of a man who wants to ask what happened and is not certain which answer he's hoping for. "He's gone," she said. "He didn't. He's gone," she said again, quieter. "He knows it's over. He'll either run or he'll present himself to the marshal when Nathan gets back." She looked at Hector steadily. "Either way, Nathan has everything he needs." Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Spanish something she didn't entirely catch, and when she raised her eyebrows, he translated. "My grandmother used to say, there are people who come into your life like weather. You can't stop them coming. You can only decide whether to take shelter or stand in it." He looked at her with those precise, assessing eyes. "You stood in it." "I had good shelter," she said. He nodded. He went back to his work. And Beatrice sat in her east room and thought about Mercer's face when she'd told him to sit down, and she thought about her father, who had walked into rooms that didn't want him there his entire life, and had never once walked out of one without having done what he came to do. She thought about what he would have said about this morning. She thought he would have been proud. The day passed in its own long way. Rosa came in the afternoon. Hector's wife, a small, careful woman of 45, who moved with the deliberate economy of someone managing constant discomfort. And Beatrice spent 2 hours with her in the East Room, working through the joint treatment she'd prepared, explaining each element and why teaching Rosa how to do the warming preparation herself at home, so she wouldn't need to make the trip every time the pain worsened. Rosa listened with the focused attention of someone who has been told for years that nothing can be done and is still not entirely convinced this is real. At the end of it, when Beatrice was wrapping Rosa's hands in the warm cloth for the final stage of the treatment, Rosa said without looking up, "My husband told me what you did, for Thomas, and the night with the men who came." "It needed doing," Beatrice said. "He says you are the best thing that has come to this ranch," Rosa said. "He doesn't say things like that. He said it." Beatrice kept her hands moving steadily. "Hector is a good man." "He is," Rosa agreed. "And he is not wrong." She looked up now with the direct, undecorated gaze of a woman who has lived enough life to have no patience for indirection. "Are you happy here?" The question sat in the room with a simplicity that made it larger than it looked. "I'm becoming happy here," Beatrice said honestly. "That might be better." Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded with the slow gravity of someone confirming something they already believed. "Yes," she said. "That is better." Nathan rode in at 7 o'clock the next morning. He came up the drive at a pace that told Beatrice watching from the porch that things had gone well, not racing, not the tight controlled speed of someone bringing bad news, but the purposeful ground-covering trot of a man who has done what he went to do and is coming home. Behind him, 2 riders' territorial marshal's men badges, visible even from the porch. Beatrice came down the porch steps and met him in the yard. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, which was not something she had seen him do before, and he covered the distance between them in 4 strides and stopped directly in front of her, and looked at her face with an intensity that was reading her the way she read injuries, searching for damage, cataloging what had happened in his absence. "You're all right," he said. It came out half question, half statement, half something else entirely. "I'm fine," she said. "Mercer was here." It wasn't a question. He'd seen it in her face. "Yes," she said. "Yesterday morning. He left. He didn't, Nathan. I'm fine." He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached out and put both hands on her shoulders, a brief firm contact, the gesture of a man making certain something is real, and then he dropped his hands and turned to the marshal's men, because there was still work to do. And Nathan Caldwell finished his work before he let himself feel things, which was a quality she had identified early, and which she suspected was going to be a recurring feature of their life together. She found she didn't mind it. She had learned to read the space between what he did and what he felt, and the space was never as large as it looked from the outside. The marshal's men took reins inside of an hour. He had spent the night in the tack room in the company of Walt, who had talked at him steadily for most of it, which Rains would later describe to the marshal as the more harrowing part of his detention. They loaded him and rode for the county seat, and Nathan stood in the yard and watched them go with the expression of a man tying off something that had required a great deal of effort. Then Mercer arrived. He came alone, which nobody had expected, and he came without his lawyer, which surprised Nathan visibly. He rode into the yard at a pace that was neither aggressive nor evasive, dismounted at the fence, and walked toward Nathan with his hat in his hands. Nathan's hand moved toward his belt. "I'm not here for trouble," Mercer said. He stopped 10 feet away. "I'm here to present myself, to the marshal's authority." He looked at Nathan steadily. "And to tell you what I know all of it, in exchange for what accommodation the court can offer." Nathan looked at him for a long time. "Why?" Mercer glanced briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the porch where Beatrice was standing. Then back to Nathan. "Your wife told me something yesterday," he said. "She told me the men who cooperated early kept more of their lives than the ones who didn't." He held Nathan's gaze. "She was right. And I have been. I have done things I cannot undo. But I can stop doing them now, and I can give the court what it needs to make the affected ranches whole, and I would like to do that." A pause. "If it means anything." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "It means something," he said finally. "I won't say it means everything, but it means something." I took Mercer inside and spent 3 hours going through everything, every document, every transaction, every name in the chain of the scheme, with the territorial authority that the marshal's men had granted him before riding out. Beatrice kept coffee coming and stayed out of the way, and listened from the East Room to the steady, methodical work of a man dismantling something that had been built to cause harm and rendering it harmless piece by piece. When it was over, and Mercer had ridden to the county seat with a voluntary statement and the full cooperation of a man who had somewhere between midnight and this morning made a decision about what kind of person he was still capable of being. Nathan came and stood in the doorway of the East Room and leaned his shoulder against the frame and looked at Beatrice with the specific, unguarded expression of a man who has run out of tasks to complete and is now required to feel things. "He said you told him to sit down," Nathan said. "He was standing in a threatening manner," she said. "He's 6'2" and 230 pounds. "He was still in my kitchen," she said. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has been holding a great deal of tension and has just released it all at once, and it was the best sound Beatrice had heard in a very long time, and she felt it in her chest, in a way she had stopped pretending was just appreciation for a pleasant sound. He came into the room. He pulled the stool from the workbench and sat down, which was what she did when she needed to say something carefully, and she recognized the gesture because she had taught it to him without knowing she was teaching it. "Beatrice," he said. "Nathan. I told you I wanted to talk to you properly when I got back." "You did." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her with the directness he always used when he had decided not to manage something, but to say it plainly. "I am not a man who talks about what he feels with any particular ease," he said. "I want you to know that up front, because it's relevant." "I know," she said. "I also want you to know that the fact that I'm bad at saying it does not mean I'm uncertain about it." He held her gaze. "I'm not uncertain. I have not been uncertain for a while now. I was stubborn about it, which is different from uncertain." "I know that too," she said softly. "I married you because I needed practicality," he said. "That is true, and I'm not going to dress it up. But what I have now is—" He stopped. He was not a man who reached for elaborate language, and he was not going to start now. "It's not practical," he said. "What I feel for you is not the least bit practical. It is inconvenient and considerable, and I would very much like to stop pretending it isn't there." The East Room was very quiet. Beatrice looked at him. This man who had given her a home without knowing he was giving her one, who had built her a room and thanked her for who she was, and ridden before dawn to protect what they were building together, and come back with his hat pulled down and his eyes going straight to her face before anything else. And she felt the thing she had been holding loosely, carefully, at a careful distance, simply open in her hands. "Nathan," she said, "I came here with a trunk and my father's medical kit and no particular expectation of anything beyond a decent arrangement. She held his gaze steadily. I did not expect this place. I did not expect these people. She paused. I did not expect you. Is that a good thing? He asked with the particular vulnerability of a man who does not show vulnerability and is showing it anyway. It is the best thing, she said simply. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not the brief pressure of last night, not the tucked hair in the dark, but a full, deliberate, unhurried taking of her hand in both of his. The gesture of a man who has decided to hold something and means to hold it properly. They sat like that in the east room, in the good morning light, through the east window, in the quiet of a ranch that had come through something difficult and was still standing, and Nathan Caldwell held his wife's hand and did not let go. Outside, Walt walked past the east room window on his way to the barn and looked in and stopped walking entirely for a full 3 seconds before Hector appeared behind him and pushed him firmly along by the shoulder without a word. I was just, Walt started. Move, Hector said. I was only, Walt. Hector's voice carried the patience of a man who has known Walt for 15 years. Move. Walt moved. But he was grinning the whole way to the barn, and he was still grinning at supper, and when Caleb asked him what he was so pleased about, Walt said it was nothing in particular, just the general excellence of the day, and nobody believed him, but nobody pressed it either, because some moments belong to the people inside them, and the people outside them know it. And Willow Creek, which had learned a great many things about Beatrice Caldwell in the 6 weeks since she arrived, had finally learned this one too. That evening, Gerald Ashford rode out to the ranch with a letter from the Territorial Cooperative Board restoring full authority to the member ranches and initiating recovery proceedings against Mercer's land agent in Pueblo. He sat at Nathan's kitchen table and read the relevant portions aloud, and then he put the letter down and looked at Beatrice and said without any of the social performance he usually carried, "My wife told me what you did. With Mercer, in this kitchen." It was a conversation, Beatrice said. My wife said you told him to sit down, Gerald said with an expression that was clearly fighting with itself about whether to become a smile. She said he sat. He did, Beatrice agreed. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. Then he did smile, the full version unguarded and genuine. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, Willow Creek did not deserve you when you arrived. Perhaps not, she said. We're going to do better, he said. I can promise you that. She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. I know, she said. I've been watching you all learn. Gerald Ashford left an hour later, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of an evening that has earned its rest. And Beatrice sat on the porch in the October dark with Nathan beside her, and the land going black and still around them, and the stars coming out one by one, the way they do in the high country. First one, then a scatter, then so many it becomes another kind of weather entirely. Nathan's shoulder was against hers. Not much space between them. The easy contact of two people who have stopped pretending they don't want to be close. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking my father would have liked it here, she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Tell me about him, he said. If you want to. She turned to look at him. This man asking her to give him something real. Something that cost her asking it simply and without pressure, leaving all the room in the world for her to decide. And she thought about her father, who had given her everything she was, and who had died alone on the road between two towns because he had spent himself entirely on other people and had trusted his daughter to carry it forward. I was the most generous person I have ever known, she said, and the most stubborn, and he believed with a conviction I sometimes thought was irrational that every person he treated deserved to be treated with complete respect, regardless of what they looked like, or where they came from, or what they had or hadn't done. Sounds familiar, Nathan said quietly. She looked at him. He raised you, Nathan said, as if that explained everything, because it did. She turned back to the stars, and Nathan Caldwell, a man who had told himself for 3 years that his heart had no room left, sat on his porch under the October sky, with his wife's shoulder warm against his, and felt for the first time since he lost the last person he loved that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. It was not a small feeling. It was not a careful feeling. It was not the kind of feeling that could be held loosely. He didn't try to hold it loosely. He held it the way. Beatrice held things that mattered completely, without apology, with the full intention of not letting go. Winter came to Willow Creek, the way it always did, without asking permission, without warning adequate to the actual cold. Arriving one morning as a hard frost on every surface, and a sky the color of iron from one edge to the other. The ranch absorbed it, the way the ranch absorbed everything steadily, with the practiced resilience of a place that has been through winters before and expects to go through more. Beatrice noticed the cold, the way her father had taught her to notice it, not as discomfort, but as information. Which joints would worsen? Which old injuries would wake up? Which people would need what and when and how much? She added extra preparation to Rose's treatment kit before the temperature dropped further. She made sure Walt's shoulder was moving properly because cold settled into improperly healed joints with a particular cruelty. She checked Thomas's splint for the last time before removing it 6 weeks exactly as promised, and watched him move his arm with the cautious wonder of someone reacquainted with something they'd been afraid to lose. "How does it feel?" she asked. Thomas opened and closed his hand, raised his arm, lowered it. His face did the thing young men's faces do when they are moved by something and are not certain they have permission to show it. "Like mine again, he said. "It was always yours," she said. "We just had to convince it to behave." He laughed short and genuine, and then he looked at her with the particular expression he'd been wearing more often lately. The expression of a young man who grew up without much softness in his life and is recalibrating his understanding of what adults can be. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Beatrice," she said for the 4th time. "Beatrice," he said, trying it out with the self-consciousness of someone wearing a new coat. "Thank you. For all of it. Not just the arm." She looked at him steadily. "Where are you from, Thomas, originally?" He blinked at the change of direction. "Missouri. Small town. Nothing town, really." "Family." "Father," he said. "Just my pa. He's not well. Has been less well since the hand." "Is there anyone looking after him?" Thomas looked at the ground. "Neighbor woman checks on him. He don't like accepting help much." "Most people don't," she said, "until they need it badly enough that pride becomes less interesting than relief." She paused. "Write to him, Thomas. Tell him where you are. Tell him you're all right." He looked up. "He knows I'm all right." "He knows the facts," she said. "That's different from knowing you're all right." Thomas was quiet for a moment. She could see him turning something over, the particular internal negotiation of a young man deciding whether to say the real thing or the easier thing. He chose the real thing. "He didn't want me to go," he said. "We fought about it. Bad. I left angry. I haven't. I've sent money, but I haven't written a proper letter." "Write one," she said. "Today if you can." He nodded. He put his hat on. He walked 2 steps toward the barn and then turned back. "Does it get easier?" he said. The being far from people you—" He stopped, unable to finish it in a way that didn't expose more than he was ready to. Beatrice thought about her father. About the last morning she'd seen him standing in the road outside a mining camp in Wyoming, with his kit in his hand and his hat pushed back on his head, telling her he'd be back in 3 days. He was not back in 3 days. He was not back at all. She thought about the letter she had written to him in her mind 100 times, since all the things she would have said if she'd known there was a fixed number of conversations left between them. "Write the letter," she said quietly. "Don't wait until you have the right words. The words don't have to be right. They just have to arrive." Thomas held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded a real one, deep and certain, and went to the barn, and Beatrice stood in the cold of the yard and breathed out slowly and let herself feel for just a moment the particular grief of advice that comes from experience. Nathan had seen it from the porch. She looked up and found him there leaning against the post with his coffee in his hand, watching her with the expression he wore more openly, now the one that had nothing managed in it. "He'll write the letter," Nathan said when she came up the steps. "I know," she said. "You have a way of making people do things they already know they should do," he said, "without making them feel managed." "My father called it the long question," she said. "You ask them the thing underneath the thing they're actually saying." They answer the real question without realizing they've done it. She took his coffee cup out of his hand and drank from it, which had become a habit she had not consciously acquired. He said the hardest part of healing is that most people already know what they need. They just need someone to make it safe to admit it. Nathan looked at her for a moment. He was a wise man. "I was," she said. "Stubborn beyond reason and frequently impractical, but very wise." Nathan retrieved his coffee cup. "Sounds like someone I know." She gave him a look that had no heat in it and considerable affection, which was a combination she had discovered she was capable of producing specifically in response to him, and which she suspected he was aware of, given the way the corner of his mouth moved. The territorial hearing was set for the second week of November. It had been 3 weeks in the organizing the marshal's office, the cooperative board, Gerald's lawyers, the county recorder's office in Pueblo, and 3 separate ranching families whose land notes Mercer's agent had been quietly acquiring. Mercer himself had continued cooperating with the resigned thoroughness of a man who has calculated his options and chosen the least damaging one available to him. His lawyer had negotiated an arrangement full testimony, full restitution from his personal holdings in exchange for a reduced territorial sentence and the right to sell his remaining land rather than have it seized. The affected ranches would be made whole. The cooperative would survive. The water rights corridor would remain distributed among the member ranches as originally established. Nathan had worked 18-hour days for 3 weeks to get there. Beatrice had watched him do it with the focused, methodical energy of a man who understands that justice does not organize itself, and that someone has to do the unglamorous work of making certain that people who were wronged actually receive the remedy they're owed, rather than a version of it that is convenient for the people in authority. She had fallen in love with him during those 3 weeks, in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated, because falling in love with Nathan Caldwell's charm, or his looks or his manner was one thing, and she had already done some version of that, but falling in love with his work ethic, with the way he cared about the 3 ranching families by name, and kept their specific situations distinct in his mind, and checked on them personally, with the way he stayed late at Gerald's office on a Tuesday, when there was nothing romantic or impressive about it, just paperwork that needed to be right. That was something else. That was the kind of love that did not diminish with familiarity, that grew with it. She hadn't said this to him yet. She was working up to it in her own way. The morning of the hearing, Vivian Ashford appeared at the ranch before 7 o'clock. Beatrice heard the horse and came to the door, and Vivian was already dismounting with the brisk purposefulness of a woman on a mission she has decided upon and intends to complete efficiently. "I have something for you," Vivian said, coming up the porch steps with a package under her arm wrapped in brown paper. "Before you go, I want you to have it before you walk into that hearing." Beatrice took the package. It was heavier than it looked. "Open it," Vivian said. Inside the brown paper was a coat. Dark wool, well cut, with a quality of material that Beatrice recognized immediately as considerably above anything she currently owned. It was not showy. It was the kind of coat that communicated without announcing that the person wearing it was someone who deserved to be taken seriously. Beatrice looked up at Vivian. "You are going to walk into a territorial hearing today," Vivian said with the directness of a woman who has made her decision and is not interested in deflection. "And you are going to sit beside your husband, and every person in that room is going to look at you. Some of them already know who you are. Some of them don't yet." She held Beatrice's gaze. "They should see you clearly. That coat will help them see you clearly." "Vivian," Beatrice said, "this is too much." "It is the correct amount," Vivian said firmly. "I spent 6 weeks trying to make you invisible in this town. This is me correcting that." She paused. "Also, I had it fitted from memory, which was a considerable act of concentration, and I would appreciate it if you would simply put it on and not argue with me." Beatrice looked at the coat. She looked at Vivian. She thought about 6 weeks ago when this woman had ridden to her kitchen with a practiced social cruelty that had seemed immovable, and she thought about the distance between that woman and the one standing on her porch at 7 in the morning, with a coat fitted from memory, and an expression of fierce, determined generosity. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Vivian said. Then, with a slight shift in her voice that made it warmer and less armored, "You have been very patient with me, Beatrice. I know I was not easy to..." "Vivian." Beatrice put a hand briefly on her arm. We've already done that. We're past it. Vivian looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. We are. She squared her shoulders. Now go put the coat on. Gerald and I will see you at the hearing. She went back to her horse and rode off with the efficiency of a woman who has completed her objective, and Beatrice stood on the porch holding a wool coat that fit her exactly right and felt in a way that was both simple and overwhelming, genuinely seen. Nathan appeared in the doorway behind her. He looked at the coat. He looked at the direction Vivian had ridden. He looked at Beatrice. Vivian Ashford, he said with the specific tone of a man whose understanding of a person has just been revised upward significantly. People change, Beatrice said. Apparently. Put your good shirt on, she said. We have a hearing to get to. The territorial hearing was held in the county courthouse, a solid stone building that smelled of wood polish and old paper and the accumulated weight of decisions made within its walls over many years. The room held 40 people when Beatrice and Nathan walked in, and it was already close to full. She felt the attention when she walked through the door. Not the hostile, dismissive attention of the train platform 6 weeks ago. Something different. The attention of people who knew her now, or knew of her, or had heard something that had made them want to see her in person and form their own opinion. She walked to the seat beside Nathan and sat down and put her hands in her lap and looked forward, and she wore the coat Vivian had fitted from memory, and she did not perform anything. She was simply there the way she was always simply there, entirely herself without apology or performance. And apparently that was enough to hold a room's attention on its own. The hearing took 4 hours. Mercer's testimony was methodical and damning, and delivered with the flat affect of a man who has made peace with what he is doing and is focused on doing it accurately rather than dramatically. He named names. He produced documents. He walked the court through the full architecture of the scheme from inception, 18 months of planning, the forged signatures, the land agent in Pueblo, the deliberate targeting of ranches that were vulnerable, and a sheriff who was respected enough that damaging his reputation would remove the most effective obstacle to the plan. When the cooperative's attorney read out the recovery amounts for each affected ranch family, Beatrice watched the faces of the ranchers sitting in the row ahead of her. 3 families. Husbands and wives sitting with the tight-shouldered tension of people who have been afraid for months and are not yet entirely certain. They're allowed to stop being afraid. She watched the moment the numbers were confirmed, watched the moment the fear broke and became something else. Something that doesn't have a precise name but lives in the shoulders when they finally drop and in the breath that comes out after too long held. The wife of the smallest rancher. A woman perhaps 10 years older than Beatrice, worn in the particular way of someone who has been carrying weight for a very long time, turned in her seat and found Beatrice's eyes across the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look said everything that needed saying, and Beatrice held it for a moment and nodded just slightly, and the woman turned back to the front and put her hand over her husband's hand on the bench between them. Nathan saw it. He said nothing. But his hand found Beatrice's knee briefly, a contact, a recognition, and then returned to his own lap. When it was over, and Mercer had been remanded, and the papers had been signed, and the court had been adjourned, the room did not empty quickly. People moved through it in clusters talking, some of them crying quietly, some of them standing with the stunned stillness of people processing the end of a long fear. Nathan was claimed immediately by the marshal and Gerald and 3 members of the cooperative board, and Beatrice let him go because that was his work, and she recognized his work the same way he had learned to recognize hers. She was standing near the back of the room when the woman from the front row found her. "Mrs. Caldwell," well, she said. Her name was June Harker. Her husband Robert was a step behind her with his hat in his hands. "I want to my husband, and I want to thank you." "Nathan did the work," Beatrice said. "Nathan did his work," June said. "You did yours." She paused. "I heard about the man in your kitchen, Mercer, the way you handled that. And I heard—" She stopped. She was not a woman who cried easily. Beatrice could tell the kind of woman who has learned to hold things until they can be held privately. She was very close to the edge of that right now. "I heard you sat across the table from the man who was going to take everything from us, and you looked him in the eye, and you told him what was right. I told him what was true, Beatrice said quietly. Same thing, June said. She reached out and took Beatrice's hand in both of hers and held it with the grip of someone transferring something real. Same thing, Mrs. Caldwell. Robert Harker put his hat back on and nodded once, the particular nod of a ranching man expressing something he does not have words for, and they went, and Beatrice stood holding the warmth of June Harker's hands for a moment after they were gone. The hearing had taken 4 hours. Getting out of the courthouse took another 2 because Willow Creek in its entirety appeared to have attended and felt it had things to say, and Nathan was patient with all of it, because he was Nathan Caldwell, and patience with the people he served was as natural to him as breathing. Beatrice watched him work the room with the same focused attention she'd given everything about him over 6 weeks, and she thought about what she wanted to say to him and how to say it, and whether there was a right moment for it, or whether she was in fact making the same error she had warned Thomas against, waiting for conditions that were never going to be perfectly right, when the only thing required was that she arrive. It was dark by the time they rode home. The cold had settled in fully, the kind of cold that comes down from the high ridges at night and means business, and Beatrice sat close to Nathan in the wagon with her shoulder against his, and the wool coat doing everything Vivian had intended it to do, and Nathan drove with the reins easy in his hands, and the comfortable silence of a man who has done something difficult and done it well, and is allowing himself to know it. Nathan, she said. Yes. She looked at him in the dark. I want to tell you something. He turned his head toward her. The reins stayed easy. I have spent my entire life arriving at places, she said. Moving in, moving on. Getting good at not wanting to stay, because staying was never something I got to do. She held his gaze as steadily as she could in the moving dark. I want to stay here, not because I have nowhere else to go, because this is where I want to be. This ranch, this town, these people. She paused. You. Nathan was quiet for long enough that she felt the edge of uncertainty, and then he said in a voice that was very quiet and entirely unmanaged, Beatrice, I have wanted you to stay since about the 2nd week you were here. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that in a way that didn't. He stopped. In a way that left you room to choose it freely. I didn't want you to stay because you felt obligated. I needed you to stay because you wanted to. I want to, she said. Then stay, he said, simply, completely, as if it were the easiest and most important sentence he had ever said, which it possibly was. She put her head against his shoulder, which she had not done before, and he adjusted his arm to make room for it, which told her he had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting, and they rode the rest of the way home through the cold dark of the Colorado Territory, with the stars overhead, and the sound of the horse, and the particular silence of 2 people who have arrived somewhere together. The ranch was lit when they pulled in. Hector had left the lamps as he always did when they were expected late, and the light from the windows came warm through the dark, and Beatrice felt it land in her chest with the full weight of what it meant. A lit house waiting. People who had left it lit because they knew she was coming back. She had never in her life had a lit house waiting. She sat in the wagon for a moment longer than necessary, just feeling it. Come on, Nathan said, quiet and gentle. It's cold. She went inside. The weeks that followed built on each other, the way good things do, quietly without drama, through the accumulation of ordinary days that were each of them better than the ones before. Rosa's hands improved enough that she came on her own some mornings, walking the 2 miles from town with a jar of something she'd made in her own kitchen, the beginning of an exchange that was equal in a way that mattered to both of them. Walt's shoulder was fully recovered by December. A fact he announced at breakfast one morning by lifting a cast-iron skillet overhead with one hand, which was not a medical recommendation Beatrice had made, but was nevertheless the most convincing demonstration of recovery she had witnessed. Thomas wrote his letter to his father. He told Beatrice about it 3 days after he sent it in the casual, sideways way young men report things they care about deeply. He had written 4 pages, he said. He wasn't sure it was the right words. It arrived, she said. That's the right words. He nodded. He went back to work. 2 weeks later, a letter came back, the first one, and Thomas read it in the bunkhouse alone, and came to supper that night with red-edged eyes and an appetite that suggested he had remembered how to breathe fully. He did not talk about the letter. He didn't need to. It was visible in him the way healed things are visible, not in the absence of the wound, but in the way the person moves lighter. Somehow the weight of the untended thing finally set down. Mavis Hutchins became unexpectedly something approaching an ally. She was not effusive, that was not her nature, but she stopped the inventory gaze entirely, and she started setting aside particular items she knew Beatrice needed for her medical work without being asked, and she mentioned to anyone who came into the store and expressed any uncertainty about seeking treatment from the sheriff's wife that Beatrice Caldwell was the most capable healer she had encountered in 20 years in Willow Creek, and they should not be foolish about it. Coming from Mavis, this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. The Territorial Board's certification letter arrived in December. Nathan brought it in from the post still sealed and set it on the workbench in the East Room without comment, and Beatrice looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Judge Crane had made the referral himself, apparently in the letter he'd sent from the circuit. She had not known this until Nathan told her, and the information sat in her chest with a warmth she hadn't anticipated. She opened the letter. The Territorial Board of Colorado hereby certifies Beatrice Caldwell as a licensed frontier healer with full authority to practice within the territory of Colorado, to charge for services rendered, and to maintain a recognized medical practice. She read it twice. She set it down. She picked it back up and read it a third time because she wanted to make certain she had read it correctly, and she had. Nathan was watching her from the doorway. "Well," he said. She looked up at him. "My father never had a piece of paper," she said. "He never needed one." "No," Nathan agreed. "He didn't. But you're not your father." She looked at him. "You're you," he said. "You're building something different from what he built." He moved through the territory and left healing behind him as he went. You're staying somewhere. You're building something that stays." He held her gaze steadily. "A piece of paper that says the territory recognizes what you know, that's not replacing what he gave you. It's what you've built on top of it." Beatrice held the letter. She thought about her father standing in a road in Wyoming with his kit in his hand. She thought about him saying the last morning she had seen him well, that the best thing a person could do with what they'd been given was to give it somewhere it would root. She had thought at the time that he was talking about settling down. She understood now with the particular clarity of hindsight and distance and time that he had been talking about her. About finding the place where what she carried could take hold and grow into something larger than either of them could have predicted. She looked around the East Room. The shelves Nathan had built, her father's instruments in their careful order, Rose's treatment records in her own handwriting, Thomas's note on the corner of the workbench left there 3 weeks ago that said simply, "Thank you," in his large, unsteady script, the certification letter in her hands. She looked at Nathan in the doorway. "Will you help me hang this?" she said. He smiled, the full one, the one that had taken 6 weeks to appear and was now considerably less rare. "Yes," he said, "I will." The town of Willow Creek held a gathering in January to formally recognize the recovery of the grain cooperative and the establishment of Beatrice Caldwell's medical practice. It was Vivian Ashford's idea, organized with Vivian Ashford's particular efficiency and social precision, which meant it was well attended and well catered, and ran approximately on schedule, which was not something gatherings in Willow Creek typically managed. Beatrice stood at the front of the room beside Nathan and received the acknowledgments of people who 6 weeks ago had whispered about her on a train platform, and she received each one with the same straightforward warmth she brought to everything, not diminished by the memory of where they had started, not inflated by the satisfaction of being right, just present with each person in front of her, which was what she had always been, and which she had come to understand was the whole of her power. Vivian spoke first because Vivian had organized it, and Vivian was not going to organize something and then not speak at it. 6 weeks ago, Vivian said, standing at the front of the room with the composed authority of a woman entirely in her element. "I made a decision about a person I had not spoken to. I decided based on nothing of substance that she did not belong here." She paused. "I was wrong. I was wrong in a way I intend to spend some time making right. And I intend to start by saying in front of this entire room that Beatrice Caldwell has more right to be in Willow Creek than most of us who were born here because she chose it." She came here, and she saw what this town needed, and she gave it without asking whether this town deserved her first. The room was quiet. She deserved better from us at the beginning, Vivian said. She will get better from us going forward. That is a promise I am making to this room and to her. She sat down. Beatrice looked at Nathan beside her. He was looking straight ahead, with the expression of a man who is feeling a great deal and is managing it with his jaw. She put her hand over his on the bench between them. He turned it over and held hers. Gerald spoke next about the cooperative and the recovery, and then the marshal's representative said something about Nathan's work, and then Pastor Webb said something brief and genuine, and the whole time Beatrice sat with Nathan's hand in hers and felt the weight of the room's attention and let it be what it was. Not a verdict, not a judgment, not approval she had spent months earning. Just people, a community. Coming around the way communities do when they're given the chance to slowly and imperfectly and eventually. After when the food was out and the room had loosened into conversation, June Harker found her again. "How's Robert?" Beatrice asked. "Sleeping through the night for the first time in months," June said. "Me too." She paused. "We're going to be all right." "Yes," Beatrice said. "You are." June looked at her for a moment. "Are you?" The question surprised her. Not its content, but its direction, the way it turned the care back toward Beatrice herself, who was not accustomed to being on that end of it. She thought about the lit windows of the ranch house coming through the dark. She thought about Nathan's hand turning over in hers. She thought about the East Room and the certification letter and her father's instruments in their careful order, and Thomas writing 4 pages to his father and Rosa walking 2 miles in the cold with a jar of something she'd made herself. "Yes," she said. "I am." She meant it all the way down. Nathan found her by the door an hour later when the gathering had run its natural course and people were beginning to drift toward their coats. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They rode home through the January cold with the stars overhead, and the land white and still around them, and the horse knew the way, and they didn't need to speak, and when the ranch came into view, lit windows, warm light cutting through the dark. Beatrice felt it again, the same as the first time, and deeper than the first time, the feeling of a house that was waiting for her. She had spent 26 years moving through the world with everything she was carried in her hands, and her head, and her heart, arriving and leaving. Putting down no roots, because the ground never held still long enough. She had learned to be sufficient unto herself. She had learned to carry her own warmth. She had not known until she stopped moving how much it would mean to share it. Nathan helped her down from the wagon. He held her hand a moment longer than the helping required in the way he had developed of making small gestures carry more than their stated weight, and she let him. And she looked up at the lit windows of the house, and she thought about her father, one last time, standing in a road, his kit in his hand, the morning light on his face saying, "Find somewhere worth staying. Be, and when you find it, stay like you mean it." She had found it. She meant it. Beatrice Holloway. Caldwell. The woman they had watched from the platform with whispers and judgment. The woman they had called too large, too plain, too ordinary. For the life she was living, had come to Willow Creek with calloused hands, and her father's medical kit, and a quiet that people had mistaken for emptiness, and she had filled every room she walked into with something that did not diminish and did not leave. The world had looked at her and seen what was easiest to see. What was actually there had never changed. Not on the train platform, not at Vivian Ashford's table, not in the frozen street with her hands on a broken bone while a crowd held its breath. And what was actually there was this. A woman who had always known her own worth, who had carried it through every town that failed to recognize it, and who had finally in the cold and the cold light of a Colorado winter brought it home. She walked through the door of her house. The warmth met her immediately. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she would never be made to feel otherwise again.